Maayong buntag, my name is Cupin. You are watching Rappler na ami karon sa International Media Center diri sa Mactan World Museum. Kay we're covering the 48th ASEAN Summit and other related meetings diri sa Cebu province. If you recall, Cebu has been host to ASEAN before in January 2026 actually. Diri nahitabo sa Cebu pod ang kumbaga the opening salvo of ASEAN, nag-ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting for the very first time with the Philippines as chairperson. But of course, karon mas bongga siya, mas dako ni siya nga meeting because all ASEAN member state leaders, well, 10 ASEAN member state leaders, including President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., are or will be coming to Cebu, plus Myanmar's representative for the 48th ASEAN Summit. I am Cupin. I am joined by my colleague Tatiana, who is also Bisaya, and she will walk you through ang economic discussions sa ASEAN. But before that, let's talk briefly kung sa maning ASEAN. So ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, saka regional grouping. It used to be 10 countries lang, current 11 now with the inclusion of Timor-Leste, and we're gonna talk about Timor-Leste actually taod-taod. So again, all 10 leaders of the ASEAN member states are coming, plus the Myanmar rep. Muna siya ang first leaders level meeting with the Philippines as chairperson. Philippines ang chair for the entire of 2026. What does that mean? So aside from physically jud, as in diri sa Philippines, not just in Cebu obviously, not just in Manila, but in different provinces, different cities across the Philippines. Iloilo will and has been host of ASEAN meetings, both big and small, but murag mo change siyang tanan because since the war in the Middle East actually ni scale down ang Philippines as ASEAN chair, which has meant so far aside from the summit nga leaders level meeting and some select meetings sa mga minister or mga secretary or mga secretaries of the Philippines and the counterparts in ASEAN, halos tanang meeting karon sa ASEAN are online. Again, in recognition of the economic difficulties being faced by different countries in ASEAN, of course, varying levels. And I think Tati will talk about that little more. So the last time nga Cebu ang host sa ASEAN was in 2007. And fun fact, tungod ito nga summit, ni change or na-enhance ang make-up or at least ang structure of ASEAN. Kaya sa una, duhara ang community sa ASEAN, security, political security, unya economic. Because of the 2000 meeting and a declaration made by ASEAN leaders ito nga time, na-expand into 3 ang communities under ASEAN, which is why we now have the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community headed in the Philippines as chairperson by the Social Welfare Secretary, si Rex Gatchalian. So again, ang unique ani nga ASEAN because nga nag-scale back ta, online ang kadaghan sa meetings, no, for better or worse. Kanipod nga summit is very hyper-focused. Isa na jud ang topic that the leaders will talk about, which is how ASEAN will respond or how ASEAN will protect itself from the effects of a war in another side of the world. Katong pag-attack sa US ug Israel sa Iran, of course you would know by now, has had far-reaching consequences beyond the Middle East. Ni abot siya sa ASEAN, which is very heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil, which of course Tati will talk to you about.
Thanks, Maya. So, tama, no? Grabe ka important and hyper-focused ang discussions karon sa oil crisis brought by the ongoing situation sa Middle East. And this is very, very important para sa Pilipinas. Kay, if you recall, back in March, nag-declare si President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. of National Energy Emergency. The biggest pain point manggod for the Philippines is net importer ta sa oil and specifically diesel. Grabe kay na siya ka-importante kay dili lang nato siya ginagamit sa atong mga sakyanan, sa transport sector, but ginagamit man sad gud ang diesel para sa mga power plants that are powering communities, particularly island communities. So it's been a huge pain point because of that. Fuel prices have risen to record highs and tungod sad ana because kung gataas ang presyo sa crude, diba? Gataas ang presyo sa uban mga gamit, like food in particular and other commodities. And in fact, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas forecasts na moabot og 6.3% ang average inflation rate nato karong tuiga. So, how does ASEAN come into the picture? So, ang regional bloc manggod ang gahuna sila mga different ways na ma-mitigate ang effect sa oil crisis sa ilang mga communities. Kasi syempre dili lang ang Pilipinas ang naka-affect sa oil crisis, right? It's also the rest of the country. They're also the rest of the regional bloc rather. They're also grappling with high prices, and they're also trying to figure out ways kung unsaon og manage ang ilang fuel supply and energy supply. So just a few days before the summit itself last week, ang mga economic ministers of ASEAN, and we are represented here by Department of Trade and Industry Secretary Cristina Roque, nag-release sila og statement on the impact sa Middle East crisis sa regional bloc. So one key commodity, yes, ang mga presyo sa mga palitonon, they have been on the rise, but one commodity in particular that they are worried about is the price of fertilizer. Kaya kung mutaas mo ang presyo sa fertilizer, kay ma-affect jud ang food supply nato, so ma-affect ang productivity sa atong farmers, and because of that mutaas ang presyo sa bugas ug sa ubang mga pagkaon, and in fact gataas na siya karon, di ba? So to mitigate the effects sa Middle East crisis sa mga member states, so nagsabot sila that they want to do or pursue these several things. So una, gusto nila ma-ratify ang ASEAN Petroleum Security Agreement or APSA. So grabe ni ka-importante ang APSA because ang isa ka provision ani, isa ka part ani is a fuel sharing deal among the member states. So kung mahitabo na silang like Middle East crisis or some other crisis that will affect the global economy, pwede nagsabot na dan ang ASEAN, bali na kanang okay, sige, we'll share fuel with each other to make sure na protect to make sure na steady ang fuel supply, and to make sure na dili lang steady ang fuel supply but mas stabilize ang prices because of that. So second, kung gataas ang presyo sa crudo, gataas sa ang presyo sa kuryente. So the ASEAN economic ministers and even ang mga energy ministers nato, actually led by DOE Secretary Sharon Garin, they've also agreed to pursue what we call an ASEAN power grid. So ang goal ani is to basically connect ang mga electricity grid sa 11 ka member states, and they plan to do that by 2045. So in case like again na mga times of crisis such as this one, they are able to share such a crucial resource such as electricity easier with each other. So the last one, and I think perpetual ni siya, permanente ni siya gina-pursue in any summit really, is trade agreements, free trade agreements in particular. DTI Secretary Roque has mentioned that gusto nila i-strengthen and further enhance some of existing free trade agreements that they already have to make sure na free-flowing ang trade. They don't want na kanang na ay mga bottlenecks, kay kung na ay mga bottlenecks, ma-affect ang supply and ma-affect sa ng prices, di ba? So, nag-agree ang ASEAN economic ministers na dili sila mag-impose og mga trade restrictions on other ASEAN countries. So an example ani is, for example, if mag-export ban sa mga essential goods. So they've agreed na dili sila mag-implement og mga inana towards their other fellow ASEAN neighbors. So cheaper and steady power, fuel supply, food security. So these are just some of the main goals na target jud or kanang istoryahon jud sa mga economic ministers during the ASEAN Summit. And if these deals hold in future oil crises or even global crises in general, not just oil related, it could spell the difference actually between soaring inflation nagaka-experience na nato karon, and stable prices, not just for Filipinos but for everyone who is living within ASEAN as well. So that's about it para sa mga economic topics. So Bea, maybe you can talk about the political and the social-cultural topics as well.
Siguro, I skipped explaining unsa may point sa ASEAN, no? So ang ASEAN, again, 11 member states, Myanmar, ang iyang representative kay ang non-political person for now, ang representative sa Myanmar. So the point of ASEAN, ideally, kumbaga magtinabangay ang mga members of ASEAN. There's a very interesting statistic right behind the camera right now. By 2030, ASEAN is poised to become the 4th largest economy in the world. And ang core belief sa ASEAN is that dili na siya ma-achieve kung dili magtinabangay ang the different states, the different economies within ASEAN. So a lot has been said about the potential of ASEAN. We have a young workforce, dako ang potential. That has been a discussion since time immemorial, the potential of ASEAN. So when leaders meet in Cebu, whether it's in Cebu, magkita ba sila sa Malaysia, sa Indonesia, in an ideal world, ang ultimate goal is really to figure out what is the optimal way na magtinabangay ang ASEAN, given its varying interests, lahi-lahi nga interests, lahi-lahi nga inclinations, with the solitary goal of furthering the region. Ang ginatawag, this can be simplified into yung ASEAN centrality. Now, when you engage with partners, whether it be as ASEAN or whether it be as an individual nation, ang parang beyond your national interest, hunaon pud nimo ang interests of ASEAN, which can be a very tricky and contentious thing to think about. So anyway, aside from food and food security, unya ang volatility of oil prices and also energy security, ang isa pud nga major topic by the leaders meetings, in the leaders meetings rather, ugma, kay ang migration. So migration or the protection of migrant laborers from ASEAN. And if you notice, kani nga tulong nga topics actually, very crucial siya for the Philippines in particular. In all of ASEAN, it's the Philippines that is most dependent on crude oil or petroleum products from the Middle East. Right? Near 90% was it? Or upwards of 90%. Ang dependence sa Philippines on Middle Eastern oil. Of course, by now, the Philippines has found other sources. But again, ang uban nga ASEAN countries, nag-vary ilang dependence on Middle Eastern oil. Migration, if you talk about migration too, it's the Philippines actually, where most migrant workers from Southeast Asia come from. Right? Just pulling out a few statistics, the estimate is around 8.3% of migrant labor worldwide comes from Southeast Asia, nearly half of which work in the services sector. So, domestic work, hotels, sa mga BPO pod, abroad or whatever. Kani siya mga trabaho actually are quite vulnerable to disruptions like the war on Iran. Kaya kung stop ang work, the service sector is among the first to be disrupted. Kaya syempre, dili ka if hostilities are rising, iposa nimo ang tourism, etc., etc. So, ang discussion sa ASEAN Summit by the leaders will talk about mas broadly, they put it more broadly, protection of Southeast Asian nationals across the world. But really, it's more pointed. It's really trying to protect migrant workers in other parts of the world. So again, na-mention ako, di ba nga, in Cebu, in 2007, dito nabago ang organization of ASEAN. Himugtulo ang communities, ang socio-cultural. Ang socio-cultural communities, sila po actually ang oversight nila, not just the cultural development in the individual countries and in ASEAN as a whole, but they also touch on the protection of migrant workers as well. So, isa na nga major topic. So, duha ang meetings in all summits na ay retreat. That's more informal, na apoy plenary. That's the more formal meeting of the leaders. So, in both meetings, they will be talking about their responses so far and how they plan to shield ASEAN from future disruptions. Dili lang ang ongoing disruption caused by the war on Iran. Pero, simba ko palayo, any other possible na shifts sa geopolitics that could affect economies beyond the area where the conflict is happening. So, I just want also to pull out, kanang, para ma-understand po na to, why it's so difficult to find solutions in ASEAN also. Sa ASEAN kasi, di ba, na concept of ASEAN centrality, na apoy concept of consensus. So, kung dili magkasinabtanay ang all 11 members, there is no deal. There is no statement, there is no agreement. So, kailangan all 11 members in varying degrees will agree to what is put out by ASEAN. Kung dili magkasinabtanay, the statement will be in an ASEAN chairman's statement, the form of a chairman's statement na lang, dili siya leader statement. So, and why do I mention this? Na a recent survey ang ICS Yusof, that's a Singapore-based think tank, indicating, well, dili man ni siya bago, na indicating na lahi ang variance or lahi ang sentiments across Southeast Asia towards China, towards the US, the two superpowers, of course. Pero na ay shift na na-notice, this is not dramatic in that karon lang nahitabo, pero it's a gradual shift. So according to that survey of mga thought leaders across Southeast Asia, less welcoming na daw ang Southeast Asia as a whole to US political and economic influence. And what's interesting there is that according to that survey, ang mga na-survey kay mga academics, mga analysts, mga even NGO workers, and I think even civic servants were part of that essay. Ang ilahang top concern sa Southeast Asia, geopolitically, was US leadership under Donald Trump. Usually, ang top na concern sa survey would be more regional issues such as the South China Sea. But this year, for the first time, and this is before the war on Iran, ang ingon sa mga experts in Southeast Asia, they're worried about US leadership under Donald Trump. And why do they worry about this? Of course, kung unsay mga decisions sa US will ultimately affect Southeast Asia, as proven by its war on Iran, which has affected Asia the heaviest, and Southeast Asia in particular. I think ang mention ni Secretary Lazaro kanina, upwards of 65% or 60% of oil or energy in Southeast Asia we source in one way or another from the Middle East. So you can imagine ang impact on the region as a whole. So tungod kay focused kaayo ang ASEAN sa Middle East response, na ay mga issues nga the leaders will not take up, as decided upon by the Philippines in consultation, of course, with other ASEAN members. So, ano sa mga issues na? One, isa sa pinaka-main goal sa Philippines as chairperson of ASEAN is to conclude the Code of Conduct on the South China Sea. Kung saan yung COC on the South China Sea, dugay na kayo ni siya ka negotiations. As in, early 2000s, grade school pa ko, dili pa ko reporter, nag-start na ang negotiations for this code. Kung saan siya na code, ideally, it would prevent escalation of tensions or tensions altogether in the South China Sea. Of course, na ay mga claimants or na overlapping claims in the South China Sea from ASEAN members, including the Philippines. So, ang COC on the South China Sea would cover ASEAN and China, who claims almost all of the South China Sea. Nganong important ang South China Sea? Well, a third of the world's trade passes through the South China Sea. So, if you think about it, dili lang siya concern sa ASEAN actually or sa China. It's the concern of the global economy. Kay a third of the world trade passing through the South China Sea, which means you don't want tensions to arise there, whether it be bilateral tensions or multilateral tensions. So gusto nimo, you want a free and open Indo-Pacific, as Japan would say, and you want a safe and peaceful South China Sea. Dili siya i-discuss sa leaders karon, pero there were negotiations on the COC on the South China Sea in Beijing a week ago. Ingon sa DFA, ASEAN spokesperson Das or Deputy Assistant Secretary Dax Imperial, they are encouraged daw by the progress of talks. But again, the deadline or the aspiration is for talks to conclude by 2026. Let's see where that goes. Again, given all these other issues nga mas urgent at mas important, therefore na i-take up right away ng ASEAN. But of course, COC talks happen parallel to or separate from the ASEAN Summit. So isa pa nga major issue nga that won't be discussed by the leaders but will be discussed or has been discussed by the foreign ministers, the issue of Myanmar. Gimension ako gaina nga dili ASEAN member state leader mo represent sa Myanmar here in Cebu. It has not represented or dili political ang representative sa Myanmar since 2021 when ASEAN leaders decided that dili pwede na junta or yung junta leadership ang mo represent sa ASEAN. So for the past several years, ang representative sa Myanmar is a civic servant, ang ilang permanent secretary for foreign affairs. That will not change for now tungod kay dili siya i-take up sa mga leaders. Only leaders can change that status quo. So far, status quo siya. But Secretary Lazaro, the Foreign Secretary of the Philippines, also the ASEAN Special Envoy to Myanmar, ingon siya gaina sa Foreign Ministers meeting na she will deliver a report on the status of Myanmar and the elusive 5-point consensus or kadtong peace plan that ASEAN laid out for Myanmar. So we'll see what will happen from there. Again, daghan kay mahitabo today. Okay, today is devoted to the ministerial level preparatory meetings para ugma sa summit. So ang summit, medyo short lang siya, mga a little over an hour magstorya ang mga leaders. But that's only because hours had been spent before that meeting. Ang mga ministers, sabot ministers, senior officials, so mga undersecretary in the Philippine context, no. So kumbaga, kung munang 1 hour lang ang meeting sa mga leaders ugma or a little over an hour, tungod kay a lot more time has been spent by ministers and senior leaders fleshing out these very important discussion points in ASEAN. So unya, taod-taod, actually later this afternoon, President Marcos, as chair of ASEAN, will convene BIMP IAGA. That's a sub-regional grouping by Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. It's meant to focus on areas of those 4 countries that are don't get as much economic attention. We'll see what comes out from that meeting. But the whole day today, foreign ministers are meeting, economic ministers are meeting, and then they're jointly meeting. Siguro muna siyang indication, no, kung unsa ang priorities sa ASEAN in this summit. It's really about the protecting the economies of the different ASEAN nations. So Tati and I and our other colleagues will be here in Cebu until tomorrow to report about the ASEAN Summit here in Cebu. If you want more updates, we have a live updates page sa Rappler.com. Pwede po ka mo download sa Rappler app na ay Security and Global Affairs community chat na po yung updates nga dito. We're airing live all of the meetings or the opening statements of the meetings. Kaya ang meeting itself, dili siya live. Pero we air the opening statements of the meetings live. If you want updates on ASEAN, just follow Rappler. Did we miss out on it? Apa ba'y kailangang storyaon?
I think na-cover na nato tanan mga ASEAN 101 so far.
Yeah. Taod-taod, or not taod-taod, unyang gabi, we'll be going live again. I'll be joined by another colleague, si John Sichon, who is based in Cebu. Storyaon nato kung unsa ang mga preparations sa Cebu province for a summit or a meeting as high stakes as ASEAN. But for now, maghinay-hinay sa amin. And we will start covering the other meetings as well. This has been Bea Cupin.
Ako si Tatiana Maligro. Thank you so much for watching.